Hi, my name is Alexis Davison, and I am going to convey why the film Gentleman's Agreement is representative of a shift of the mindset of Americans in the late 20th century. Now imagine yourself as a Jewish immigrant in the 1800s, and you just entered the United States. But you're receiving terrible treatment and are being called names such as Christ Killer and Dirty Jew. Your community, family, and friends are being targeted and mistreated and misrepresented in newspapers and magazines, such as depicted in this slide behind me. In this scene, the crucifixion scene, you see political parties being represented and the collection of money. In this scene behind me, you now see another advertisement of New York being depicted as a new Jerusalem, and how people are trying to get away from the influx of Jewish immigrants, away from the East Coast. This hostility is not what you imagined the land of the free would be like. But now, let's fast forward to the 1900s. Now, you are an established type in society. You are being assumed as power-hungry individuals, as deceitful individuals, and as being disloyal to the United States. The Great Depression occurs, and the country actually limits the amount of Jewish immigrants that could come into the country. Other events, such as World War II, occur, and these labels, stereotypes, and assumptions just get worse. Public officials are even open about having negative opinions on Jewish immigrants. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt even has misgivings about Jews publicly. You hear of Jewish reporters being insulted by U.S. congressmen. And once the Holocaust is known, once the World War II ends, the affluent and elite don't stop. They still target Jewish Americans. But then, in the middle of the 20th century, something changes. You begin to see individuals speak out against the injustices that you have lived through the past several years. This movement of change is what embodies the film Gentleman's Agreement. It is a film in which symbolizes a moment of change, of a shift away from anti-Semitic tendencies of the late 20th century. Gentleman's Agreement was released 2 years after World War II and was based on Laura Hobson's novel of 1946. It is a story of a male journalist in New York City who is assigned to write a series on anti-Semitism, but it is so much more. Philip Green, which is the male journalist in the novel and film, takes it upon himself to live a Jewish reality. His innocence of his son motivates him to do this because his son doesn't understand why people are being mistreated simply because they're Jewish. This motivates him to experience the effects of anti-Semitism in order to convey the emotion behind those experiences to the rest of the nation in hopes of invoking change. Now, there are many emotional and intense moments of the film. One instance is when he has a quarrel with his secretary, and she calls Jewish people a kike type of people. Kike is a vulgar term used toward the Jewish people at this time. He condescends her and emphasizes how we are talking about a word. A word is more than just something to say. This is so important because it relates to the necessity for film and other mediums at this time to be in existence, because society at this time need to be reminded that words have meaning and that actions correlate to those meanings. Other instances in the film, like the one being depicted, is when Philip Green is rejected at an affluent clientele resort because he's Jewish. He experiences that ostracizing effect of being a segregated minority. In this next slide, you see his friend Dave Goldman almost getting into a fight with a man because he was called a Yid. Yid is another vulgar term at this time, and the expressions on the individuals' faces in this picture convey the emotional intensity present in the entire film. But the most emotional moment of all is when Philip Green's son Tommy comes home crying and completely shaken because he was called a dirty Jew. This instant is the utmost blow of the entire film because it shows that the phenomenon of anti-Semitism is affecting those of all ages. Now, the film is rooted in pathos by way of emotional dialogue and imagery, which you have seen examples of. Audience appeals to emotions of empathy, embarrassment, outrage, but most importantly, the film appeals to familiarity. The commonality of these experiences to those of the audience is so crucial because it allows the audience members to associate the emotions of those experiences to what is occurring in the novel. It helps them elaborate on evaluating their conscience and thinking about the morality of their everyday decisions. Now, this is personified in the actual film by Philip Green's fiance, who realizes that even if you oppose anti-Semitism, it must correlate to action of your everyday life. And this motivates audience members to contemplate the same evaluation of self and change. Now, the years after this film consists of a coalition of this film and other novels and other films such as Focus, which was based on a novel written by Arthur Miller. And this coalition causes a gradual shift away from anti-Semitic tendencies. Now, the anti-Semitism is this hostility toward the Jewish people. But what these similar films and public individuals in actual society do is direct responsibility of this injustice to ordinary Americans. The character Philip Green embodies this moment of change in which introduces a new way of thinking. Now, this is important for modern day because we see minorities such as African Americans or Muslim Americans or other people that feel isolated and segregated from society. Now, after the film, data shows that there was a sharp decline in prejudice against Jews and that there was an increase in social acceptance of these individuals. But today, other minorities are suffering similar treatments despite the disappearance of anti-Semitism directed at Jews. We need to analyze artifacts such as Gentleman's Agreement so we never go back to those same tendencies and that we never negotiate gentlemen's agreements that are present in the 20th century as depicted in this film. Thank you for listening.